This idea of joy and peace, of unity. Have you ever been to a holiday dinner? Holiday dinners are coming up, right? Thanksgiving's coming up. Christmas is coming up. Then it's Halloween. And normally what happens is people get together, right? They make a turkey, a ham, a duck. You all have your own special holiday traditions, right? I remember once, several years ago, I went to a man's house. I had just been a Christian probably for just a few months, I think it was. I think it was Easter, actually. It was Easter supper. And I remember my friend was a little bit more of a dogmatic type of individual. He's the kind of individual that would see you walking down the street and stop and say, "Excuse me, do you know Jesus Christ is your Savior?" And he was very, very non-casual about it. He actually would offend people just by getting into their face. This is the kind of individual that he was. Anyway, he invited me over to his house for Easter dinner. I remember we're sitting there, and his wife had gone to all these great lengths of making the turkey and the ham and all the things she had made, the stuffing, the green beans, all the things, that you ladies like to make on Easter morning or Easter after, for supper. And I remember this one particular day that I was there, he invited a friend over, and I remember everything's all laid out nice and neat. We're getting ready to pray, and then during this man's prayer, his friend had come, and during this man's prayer, he insulted the man in his prayer. I don't remember what he said, but I just remember after the prayer, I thought, "Oh man, is this Christianity or what?" Like, wow. And so the man, right in the middle of the prayer, got up and didn't say a word and just left. And I tell you, for the rest of that evening, Easter dinner, he was kind of spoiled. Well, I wonder why. Because there was no peace and harmony. There was no joy. It was supposed to be a time where you relax with friends and family and just enjoy the meal and you remember Jesus' resurrection. It's like a family meal. Have you ever had a family holiday meal like that? Everything's laid out perfect, and you join to great lengths to bring family together and friends, and there's always someone who wants to cause a ruckus or a scene. There's no joy in that, is there? There's no joy when there's contention and fighting and emotions. What we want is unity. We get along with purpose. In this case, for the meals, to have time just to relax with one another. So I wanted to look at this next idea. How do we preserve unity in the church? I mentioned before, number one, that if you have an issue with the church, if you don't like the music, you don't like the color of the carpet, you don't like the preacher, you don't like the deacons or whatever, you don't go to the preacher talk about the deacons, you don't go to the deacons talk about the preacher, you go to the preacher talk about the preacher, you go to the preacher talk about the music, you go to the deacons talk about the deacons. That's one way you preserve unity in a church, and I don't see that we're not doing that. I always like to look forward and make sure that I'm proactive. So, if you have an issue with something, come talk to me. Don't tell your neighbor. Your neighbor's not going to be able to change anything about it. I can change it, perhaps, or maybe the deacon can, or whoever does whatever. Whatever you don't like, go to that person. You do that at work, right? You don't talk about, hopefully, you don't talk about your boss to your coworker and get you fired. You go to your boss. "Hey, boss, why is this done this way?" And they'll tell you, "Oh, okay." Or maybe the boss will say, "I never thought about that. That's a good idea." But really, let's look at this passage, though. How do we preserve unity in our church and in our families? This is found in Philippians chapter 2, 3 and 4. This verse. Let's read it together. Can you see that up there well enough? Let's read it together. It says this: "Do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind regard one another as more important than yourselves. Do not merely look out for your own personal interests, but also for the interests of others." In Philippians 2, 3 and 4. So as I look at this passage, I notice what Paul is telling us here. He says this, basically, selfishness. Do nothing from selfishness. Selfishness is what we are when we're teenagers. Okay? Some teenagers. I know you guys don't apply to this, right? But a lot of times when we're teenagers, let's face it, we think the whole world revolves around us, right? We really do. And so that's what selfishness is. We only think about ourselves. We only do what's good for ourselves. We want out of the refrigerator. We don't worry about replacing it. We just do what we want because, hey, we're selfish. And also, you notice he says this: do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit. That's when we want to give ourselves the glory for things that we've done. Former President Reagan, recall one time when he was governor of California, he gave a speech down in Mexico City. And he gave his speech and he sat down to rather unenthusiastic clapping And he thought, well, okay, whatever. And so he didn't speak any Spanish. And so he sat down and thought, okay, what do I do now? And then the man after him got up and began to speak in Spanish, of course, and the president couldn't understand a lick of anything he was saying. And he noticed that after every paragraph, that when this man was speaking, the crowd just broke out in immediate applause. Well, President Reagan, felt kind of embarrassed. So after a few minutes of this, he decided he's going to clap more enthusiastically than everybody else, and he began to clap louder and longer than everybody else. Well, after about a few minutes or so, the ambassador said, President Reagan, he's interpreting your speech. So we have to watch out for empty conceit. And notice what he says here, but with humility of mind, regard one another as more important than yourselves. Humility really is this, just realizing who we are in the world, realizing our position in the world, not thinking more highly of ourselves than we really ought to. Humility is this, we realize that when we pass from this world, I used to tell my kids this all the time, humility is just a understanding of how important you really aren't. Because if any one of us, or when we're all going to die eventually, unless Jesus comes to take us back, right? But realizing this, when we die, the world won't stop turning. When we die, unless you're famous, you probably won't hit the newspapers. You won't be on CNN or Fox or anything else. We'll just pass and the life will go on. And humility is really realizing who we really are, not thinking more importantly of ourselves than we really ought to. But notice what he says here. Do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind, regard or think one another as more important than yourselves. Now what is this saying? What does this mean? What it means is this, that myself, I love myself. I do. I make sure I eat right, or I try to. I get plenty of rest. I do the things that I enjoy because I love Ed Peterson. And guess what? I would imagine if I asked each one of you, you all love yourself, right? Right? Okay. So what does this mean? It means that, what it means is that I love myself, but when I regard each of you, when I regard other people, either in my family or in the church, because I love myself so much, I need to surpass my regard for myself to you all. So what it doesn't mean is, it doesn't mean that I have to think of myself as a worm, or as somebody that's not important, or have low self-esteem. It doesn't mean I have to think, well, I'm just Ed, and I think so much more of you all, and I'm just so lowly, that I have to walk like this. It doesn't mean that. It means that we still have a good self-esteem of ourselves because of who we are in Christ. But what it means is when I think of other people, I surpass in my thinking about myself and bring that to them. Does that make sense? That's simply all it means. Regard one another as more important than yourselves. Do not merely look out for your own personal interest, but also for the interests of others. And really, that's what we do in the church. You see, if we all thought about ourselves in that way, if we didn't have our own personal agenda, if we thought of ourselves in humility, if I thought of everyone else, if I thought about your interests more than I thought of my own, then we would have what's called harmony. We'd be caring for each other and looking out for each other, and there wouldn't be any contention if there ever was any. There wouldn't be any fighting if there ever was any, and you wouldn't have some of these emotional scenes that we just saw here a few minutes ago on the video.